Welcome back to the Commercialisation of Sports series brought to you by AMSC. My name is Anthony Morrissey, the CEO and founder of AMSC, a sports consultancy company with just a little bit of a difference. Today, I'm delighted and honoured to be joined by a good friend of mine, but unbelievable knowledge person of sport, someone who knows sport so much more than I do, and insight into different areas of sport, and a viewpoint that I'd love my customers to have a think about when it comes to their stadium or when it comes to their brand and how they can actually activate things. Also, most importantly, it's going to be a good bit of fun. I'd like to introduce you to Philip O'Connor, freelance journalist and absolute podcast hero of mine from the R-Man in Stockholm. Philip, how are you doing?
I'm delighted. Thank you so much for those kind words in the introduction there, Ant. It's brilliant to be here. I'm honoured to be the guest on episode 1 here, and delighted to get cracking and talking about sport, which is something we do offline an awful lot. And the hard part is going to be keeping this chat to like 20 minutes or so, because as usual, we so much to talk about.
I know, it's going to get interesting. If you start seeing me panicking and pointing at the screen in the corner, don't worry about it. Just ignore all those things. First things first, and I'll go back to the very, very start, because with me, my passion for sport came from a very early age. My mum and dad say there's pictures of me from a baby and I always have a ball in my hand, whether that's a sliotar or whether that's a Gaelic football or that's a soccer ball or a rugby ball. For you, growing up in Dublin, what was where did sport and the whole passion come from?
I think my love of sport and my passion for sport comes from the fact that my entire relationship with my father is built around that. He is my hero. He's somebody that I look up to. He's somebody that I try to emulate. And my way of connecting with him, my way of communicating with him wasn't through, he was never a drinker or a smoker, that kind of thing. He always loved sport. And the things he loved the most were, if I go back to the early 1970s in Dublin, we all know about the great success of Dublin GAA in recent times. But at the beginning of the 1970s, Dublin GAA was not very popular, in particular Gaelic football. Dublin just weren't very good until they won the All-Ireland in 1974. So he used to go there. He was one of a handful of people who would go to every game home and away. He's a great lover of Dublin hurling. He's a great lover of the Irish national rugby team. And then in later life, he got big into Leinster, golf, tennis, you name it. And the thing was, Ant, that what came through to me the more I got to know him through sport was that he has an amazing ability to understand what it is key to any game or any sport or any occasion or any championship. He can pick it out. And that's something that I learned from him, and that's been very useful to me in sports journalism in terms of being able to say, okay, what's the story of that game or that competition or that performance in one sentence? Because he was the one that, listening to him, taught me how to find the essence of any game or of any sport story. But most of all, sport has provided a common platform for me to get to know my dad and to learn to love my dad and to learn the lessons that he has to teach me about everything from competing to community. So that's really where it comes from for me.
Yeah, it's very interesting you say that, because I think a lot of people listening or watching this will be absolutely understandable, because straight away when you're speaking there, it brings back my own memories of watching my father used to close the curtains when the Irish national soccer team was on, or the rugby team was on, or Cork hurling was on. He'd close the curtains, it'd become like a little cinema for himself, and he'd have a little cushion or a poof, and he'd be banging it on the ground when specific players didn't do what he thought they should be doing, or vice versa. Talking about your father, very quickly, was there a player that when you grew up that he was pointing to you, no matter what the sport was, and say, that's the guy, that's my generation's guy? Or was it going back to his childhood that you remember as a kid that there was the one player that stood out more than anybody else?
Well, I think it depends. Like when I came on the scene, it was around the time the great Kevin Moran was playing football, Gaelic football for Dublin. So he was somebody that we loved. Jimmy Keaveney, who was a full forward for the Dublin team at that point, he was also somebody, he was a club man in St. Vincent's. And there was one famous occasion where Dublin played a championship game, I think, and they drew. And Jimmy Keaveney was standing beside us on Hill 16. And 2 weeks later for the replay, he was the starting full forward for the Dublin team, So there was guys like that. But he had this thing, Ant, where he would... something about somebody would appeal to him, right? And then he would obsess about that particular player or that particular person. And the best example I can think of is a golfer called Philip Walton, who came from Malahide in Dublin. And Philip had a bit of a sort of a speech impediment. Now, I don't know the actual sort of medical cause of it, but he spoke with quite a sort of a strangled tone of voice, so to speak. But my father started to watch him as an amateur. And my father wasn't a man who traveled. He didn't go to games very often. He'd go to Parnell Park or Croke Park. But he actually started to to travel to see Philip Walton compete in golf. I know he went to Woburn in England to see him. And my father never liked being in England or around London, hated the underground or that kind of thing. But he was so fascinated by Philip's character without ever being able to explain why, But he was so fascinated by Philip as a talent, as a golfer, the way he played the game, the way he conducted himself. So that's one that stood out. Barcelona, Johan Cruyff, that whole idea of Dutch total football was always something that appealed to him. The rivalry between Dublin and Kerry was something that appealed to him. The Dublin hurlers, would be the current underdog for the last 15 or 20 years that he is obsessed about. And of course, when they made it to a Leinster final or an All-Ireland semi-final, that would be something that would sort of get him going. So he was really sort of never on the side of the champion, always on the side of the underdog. And all of his heroes were flawed in some way, right? Jimmy Keaveney looked like anybody sitting on a bar stool anywhere in the north side of Dublin around Marino or Dooney-Carney. But with the ball in his hand, or with a free to take or the ball in his hand, Jimmy Keaveney just became a superhero to us all, And that fascinated me because it taught me really that in the way that Danny Blanchflower said, that sport is not about winning and losing, right? We've just seen a Women's World Cup where 32 teams entered and 31 of them essentially failed because they didn't win it. Sport is about personality. It's about performance. It's about doing the things that we can never imagine being able to do ourselves, but it's also about representing that community as well. Because in sport, we see ourselves reflected. We see what we like about ourselves and we see what we don't like about ourselves. And that in turn makes us think about who we are as people, as communities, as players, as families, as fathers, brothers, sisters. And that to me is the most fascinating aspect of it. And that's why it's such a big part of our lives every day, and why people involved in sport need to realize what we're watching is not just what they do. What we're watching is who they are. And we are asking them to plot the path for us into the future, to tell us who we are.
Well, you just come on to a nice kind of segue for me, which goes into your background, into your professional connection into sport. Before I do that, you personally, when you were an 11, 12-year-old Philip O'Connor running around the streets of Dublin, was there one player for you? I know we spoke about your dad. Was there one player that you would have said, oh, God, I'd swap everything just to be X?
Sorry, there's some noise coming out here, Ant. I don't know if you can pause this or cut it out later. Just 1 sec. There's something after starting playing here.
No problem.
I don't know what's going on. Can you hear that?
I can. Do you want me to go back? Do you want to go back and start again?
Just that question, if you could. Sorry about that. I knocked it off there.
No problem at all. No problem at all. So yeah, just on you personally, you spoke about your dad and all the connection that you would have into it. But before we go into your own personal background into it, what was there one player that you, when you were growing up, that you could say that was the player I'd love to have been like?
Yeah, I think it would have to be Kevin Moran, because it was such a seminal time in my sporting upbringing, right? So we lived a few hundred meters, maybe half a kilometer from Parnell Park in Dublin. So we would have gone down there to see the Dubs train, right? This is how obsessive we would have been as a family, and my father would have been. And we would have seen Gay O'Driscoll and Jimmy Keaveney and that. But Kevin was something different. Kevin Moran was different. He had the long hair, played centre half back, and he was very much the attacking centre half back. He'd get on the ball and he'd charge up the field, right? And then he signed for Manchester United. And we went, hang on a second, right? This is just two universes colliding for us here. And then, he went over to Manchester United. He came back again. He played for the Dubs again, and then went back and did such great things for Manchester United. Now, unfortunately, he became the first player ever sent off in an FA Cup final. I think he took down Peter Reid. Was it 1983 or 85 there? So we had to live with that as well. Our hero also had feet of clay. So Kevin definitely would have been the first one, the first real sporting hero that I ever had. In my teenage years, I was always fascinated by an American basketball player called Larry Bird, who came from a dirt poor part of Indiana called French Lick, but was just an incredible basketball player. And what made him stand out, Ant, was that it wasn't just that he scored points. He had a vision on the court for passing the ball. He could see things, way before the rest of us, passes and options way before anybody else. And that fascinated me, because I couldn't understand how anybody could see the way that things were going to develop the way that he did. And he also had the skill to exploit them then. Basketball, as you might know, is a very individual game. It's 5 against 5, and one dominant player can make the difference. But Larry Bird made a dominant team because he brought the best out in everybody else as well. And I found that to be fascinating. So they were the two ones that, if there was two athletes that I could have been back in the day, Kevin Moran would have definitely been the first one and the one that I choose, with Larry Bird an absolute close second for me.
So you can't be Kevin Moran, and I'm assuming you worked that out in your late teens, early 20s, that Kevin Moran isn't going to be, Philip O'Connor's not going to be smashing down the middle of Croke Park, winning All Ireland medals or signing for Manchester United. So you looked elsewhere within sport. By the sounds of you and the passion you've been speaking, even in this 10 minutes, sport was so important to you. Did you see any other career that you could have gone down?
Well, I do and I don't, right? Because, when you're growing up and trying to work out who you are, I fell out of love with sport for a little while because sport wasn't kind to me, right? When we played Gaelic football and hurling in Donecarney and Marino back in the day, right? We went through a school system where the school was actually more important than the club for us in North Dublin. I would have played for School Wirral and for Art School Reach, And the hard part for me, Anthony, was that everything was to do with winning, right? And I always thought that I was a winner, right? I always thought that, and there was fellas, teachers who were bouncing hurls off the bench before a football match against St. David's or against some other school team and that kind of thing. And I thought, yeah, this is to motivate me and that kind of thing. And it was only when I was about 40 that I realized I just don't care about winning. I actually cared about being like Larry Bird. I cared about doing something that makes the 10 or the 20 or the 100 people on the sideline go, wow, I didn't expect that. Or wow, that was brilliant. That was perfect. And it took me an awful long time to realize that. And I was going against my own nature, right? And if I was to compare myself, now this might sound like a ridiculous comparison, but in terms of the mentality, not in terms of the skill is what I'm talking about here. If you remember Dimitar Berbatov, the Bulgarian who played for Manchester United, also a guy who I don't think cared about winning at all. I think he just went out there to express himself. So I think in terms of work, I always wanted to be a journalist, right? I always wanted to be a sports journalist in particular, right? But I didn't want to fail at it. So I never really called myself that. I never really went down any path which would have led to me failing. I tried to sort of sneak in the back door of becoming a sports journalist. And eventually I managed to succeed. It took me a long time. But back in the mid-90s now, I would have presented shows on local radio, on community radio to do with sport. I know around the Atlanta Olympics there, when Michelle Smith was swimming for Ireland there, we did a show called Talking Sport on North Dublin Community Radio that was very successful. I wrote bits and pieces. The advent of the internet, of course, helped me a great deal because anybody could sort of publish anything then. And I was able to practice writing and broadcasting and talking and learning from people like your good self and build a career out of that. And then I was working for the Reuters news agency. I started working for them back in 2002, actually as an IT technician. And I kind of got in there thinking, this is just, this is like the crack that I need, the tiny little crack that I need to get in. And after a few years then, I started to contribute a little bit to the sports reporting. And eventually then I had the chance to take it over in 2009 or so. And I've been there for the last 14 years. And I've had the privilege of covering World Cups, Olympic Games, summer and winter, European Championships. I was in the stadium the night that Christian Eriksen suffered his heart attack, which was the biggest story of the Euros a couple of years ago. So it's been a great privilege to do that. But I was kind of sneaky in how I got to do it, and that comes back from the thing of I wish I had realized who I was as a younger man than what I was, because when you realize that winning isn't everything, in fact that it's entirely irrelevant, and I know it can sound bizarre for somebody who works in sport to say that, but that's really what I'd like to pass on to the next generation of people, the next generation of people that I coach or that I play with or that I work with or train with, that winning isn't everything. The whole thing, when it comes down to be it sports or journalism, is being the best that you can be in yourself at that moment. If you can do that, nothing more can be expected and nothing less can be accepted. So it's that challenge every day when I get up and of going out and making the best podcast, playing the best bit of Gaelic football or hurling, the best bit of jiu-jitsu that I can do, being the best coach I can be, the best dad I can be, the best husband I can be. And that to me is worth so much more than any medal I ever won or any prize or any award that I've ever been given, because it's a constant. And I think that for both journalists and for athletes, that's something that we could all be striving for.
Yeah, it's a fantastic mentality, if I'm completely honest. It's definitely something that comes across in your work, if I'm being genuine to you. You fantastic podcast series we'll speak later, but also in the fact that it should come across everybody listening who's involved in sport, because you put a great point there. There's a Women's World Cup that just finished where 32 teams involved and 31 would have considered losers in there. If you're going to use the scenario of just winning the overall tournament, that's not the case because of what the legacy they've left behind. Yeah. We know in our own country, Ireland lost. I think they got knocked out in the group stages and only scored a goal, but the legacy that those ladies have left behind them for future women coming through is absolutely amazing. You just mentioned something a couple of seconds ago there about the events you've been to and some of the fantastic and less fantastic moments you've seen. Can you just give me an example of what is the best sports event you've ever attended or been part of, experienced, and just give an outline of what made it that?
There's so many to choose from. I think on a personal level, I was in the building the night that Conor McGregor beat Eddie Alvarez to win the lightweight title in the UFC and become the first simultaneous two-weight champion. And that to me was a personal milestone. Was like, I would have listened to boxing matches in the middle of the night on the radio back in the day and this kind of thing, and that to me was a personal thing. Like, it was brilliant. It wasn't the best event in terms of, how it was organized or that kind of thing, but to sit there in Madison Square Garden and to be in Las Vegas and covering big fights, that was a big thing. I think probably the best experience was probably Robbie Brady's goal against Italy in France at the Euros in 2016, because it meant so much to Ireland to get into the next round, to get into the knockout round of a major championship for the first time in a very long time. But I think I'd almost go as far as to say that there's too many to choose from. There's been so many. As I say, I've just been so lucky to cover NBA games, to cover, big boxing matches, big UFC matches, to cover a Winter Olympics, which is something I never would have imagined. I can almost hear, I don't know if you're old enough to remember Ski Sunday that used to be on the BBC, and you can hear the iconic theme music. And then all of a sudden you're standing there at the bottom of the slope, where there's Olympic gold medals being handed out. But there's been so many of them. But the best ones are always the ones, I would probably have to say, the Olympics. And the reason for that is that when you cover the Champions League or when you cover the Premier Leagues, I've done on many, many occasions, right? You're dealing with athletes who are very privileged. They are handed pretty much everything, right? They're given everything to do with their recovery, restitution, nutrition, sports science. Everything is there for them, right? But for Olympians in many sports, these sports are tiny. They're not full-time professionals. They could be teachers. They could be civil servants. They could be cops or firefighters or anything like that, right? But this is their passion. And they they get a tiny little grant maybe from the Olympic Council, whatever country they're in. But for the most part, this is not how and they're so delighted to be there and to take part and to represent their country and their people and their community. So I think those events mean more to me, because there's so much more. Money does occasionally have a corrupting influence on athletes. It gets to the point where they expect to be treated like gods, because essentially that's how they are treated 7 days a week. But I would say probably in that case, the best experience would have been watching Kelly Harrington winning a gold medal for Ireland in boxing in Tokyo. Now that I mention it, that was the greatest thing that I've ever seen, the greatest thing I was ever part of. A pandemic Olympics, there's only a handful of people in a sumo venue, essentially, in downtown Tokyo. And Kelly Harrington from Portland Row in Dublin, where my family used to live, comes in, takes on Beatriz Ferreira over 3 rounds, probably loses the first round on most judges' scorecards, but she's just such a good boxer that she was able to pull it out over the next 2 rounds. And to hear her being declared the winner in that, it was just such an emotional moment. And again, if I go back to the relationship with my father, again, he walked down to Portland Road the following morning, or that morning, to celebrate with the people down there because he used to live down there. I think that was the greatest thing that I've ever been part of. And to be absolutely honest, I don't think I'm ever going to top that, because, speaking to Kelly afterwards, having that sort of relationship to the place where she's from, it's going to be hard to beat that, my friend.
Totally get that. Totally understand. I've got my own history on boxing women's golds, and I spent 20 years of my life in Bray, and obviously Katie Taylor comes from Bray. Country, yeah. I actually played football against her father. That's how old I'm getting now, if I'm completely honest.
Not against her, but against her dad.
No, against her dad. She was a great football player. Fantastic football player. People don't realize that. But what I found amazing, I was living in London when Katie won her gold, and the company I was working for told me that I had to make sure that they were connected into the Olympics. They were doing all the kind of Wi-Fi streaming stuff, and we were all told that we couldn't stream any part of the Olympics that day, and I ignored that completely and sat there and screamed like a mad thing in an open plan office when Katie Taylor won her gold. It was one of those special moments. What I would like to ask you on that, and it kind of comes back to what people are listening in, is Kelly Harrington won it in a pandemic Olympics, right? And Katie Taylor won it with this amazing experience in London where fans were everywhere. What benefit you can give to stadiums do you think that there could have been a kind of a loss for Katie Harrington when she hadn't got the supporters, while Katie Taylor did? From your experience, what is important about a stadium and their fans and getting that right?
I think it's very important to ensure, the first thing is always the safety of the fans for me, right? So if you're going into a venue, getting in there safely, no crushes, that kind of thing. I was in Paris for the Champions League final between Liverpool and Real Madrid when there were so many problems getting in there to the Stade de France. And it's not the first time that I've seen that in that particular venue. So first and foremost for me is the safety of the fans, right? The second thing I believe, and it's the kind of thing that I think we're losing sight of at the moment, and is let the fans create the atmosphere, right? So you can prompt them but don't drown them out, right? I am sick to the back teeth of Freed from Desire and Sweet Caroline at rugby matches and at soccer matches and at boxing matches and everything else like that. Let the fans create their own atmosphere, because when we went to Croke Park, when we went to Lansdowne Road, when you go to Wembley, when you go to the Olympics, right? Let the fans do this by themselves. You don't have to spoon feed them. They're people who know sport. They're there because they're passionate about sport, and they'll carry it all by themselves, right? It's getting to the stage now where in the NBA, you'll have this organist playing in the background, and, you know, the minute a timeout is called, you know, there'll be some tune playing out of the speakers and that. Don't do that. Don't crowd out the fans, because the fans, again, are so much a part of the experience. And we saw that during the pandemic, because we were piping the noise of fans into German football stadiums and English football stadiums, you know. So I would suggest to anybody who's involved in sports that see where the decibel level is, right? I mean, take a club like Arsenal. They used to call Highbury the library, you know, because the fact that the fans didn't make that much noise. But if you have a St. James's Park in Newcastle, or if you have an Old Trafford, or if you have a Thomond Park, right, you don't really need to add too much to that, right? And what it leads to is a much more genuine rather than a generic fan experience. And that's what you want. You want a visit to the Bombonera in Argentina to be what that is, right? You don't want it to be something like some cookie cutter thing that you can get anywhere from Brisbane to Seattle. That's not what you want. Let the fans create the atmosphere, make it unique, and that will keep people coming back. If you get a reputation for having that sort of vibe in your arena, in your stadium, at your event. Now, that said, when the pay-per-view section of a UFC card starts and the Who, it's not Won't Get Fooled Against, Bob O'Reilly, they start to play this keyboard intro, well, it's magic, right? But they have the sense to cut it reasonably early and let the fans get into it. So think very carefully and make sure that what you're using, the external things that you're using, are adding to the atmosphere, are building the atmosphere, and not drowning it out.
Yeah, I think the perfect example of that for me that I've experienced in my sporting connection was when Munster played Toulouse in a quarter-final, ironically in the Aviva Stadium in Dublin, and it went to extra time, and Munster very smartly put on Zombie, which would be from the Cranberries, which obviously has a very massive connection to Limerick and an obviously connection to Munster. And I think that's what made that unique, was that the fans suddenly found that, and it's now a new calling card, because it's almost moved away from the fields of Athenry and now changed into Zombie, because it just creates that absolute aura and a connection into Limerick, and also a connection to the uniqueness of that club.
Well, also, just to interrupt you there, sorry, Ant, there's a brilliant example from the late Sinead O'Connor, who passed away recently, right? She was brought to America, I think it was UFC Boston, that she came out and she sang The Foggy Dew. She was put up like on a stage and she sang The Foggy Dew, and Conor McGregor walked out under her. I defy you to speak to anybody there who didn't get shivers down their spine when that happened, right? And that is the opposite of the cookie cutter thing. That is creating a moment in sport, right? And also it's having the sense that, like, to do that on the fly, right? Munster against Toulouse, it goes to extra, stick on Zombie. Again, it's something that adds to it, and the crowd lifts with that, right? But at the same time, if the crowd is already singing, as happens in Liverpool, for instance, when Liverpool soccer fans sing, "You'll Never Walk Alone," don't intrude on that, right? Just because you think, oh, I'm going to play Freed from Desire before. No, let them go. Let them dictate it, you know? So it really has to sort of work together. And at that time, between Munster and Toulouse, it worked brilliantly. There's so many examples of that. But now what we see oftentimes is there's a running order that's down to the second of when these songs are going to be played and when the flares go off and all that kind of thing. And I miss that spontaneity. I do think that you have to allow for the crowd to improvise and to involve them in it, because it makes for a better viewing experience, and it certainly makes for a better fan experience when you're there.
Also, for me, what it just creates, it creates those, you perfectly put it, as those moments. And moments for me is what you remember. You may not remember the score. You may remember fantastic tries or goals or whatever your sport may be, moments that are stamped in history. But what really stands out is the people involved. It's the joy that you see with people, or the sadness, whatever that may be. And it's the creation of that atmosphere. It's what players want to play in front of. It doesn't matter necessarily have to be 100,000 people. It can be something as small as 5,000 or 6,000. And I implore any of the clubs or federations of listening to this podcast to heed what Philip has just said, because I think it's about making your unique product. And whatever makes your product unique, whether that's your location, whether that's your history, whether that's your sport as a sport, whether that's connection to the community that you're there with, make sure you find that link, rather than, as Philip rightly said, having a playlist of 25 songs and I'm on number 24. I need to get to 25 quickly, irrelevant of what's going on. The future of sport, Philip, I find a fascinating question, because for me, sport isn't just about what happens necessarily on the field. We've discussed already about the importance of getting uniqueness in music and getting a fan experience, and also the passion and importance that sport plays for everybody's lives. But where do you see the future of sport?
I think the future of sport is in the sort of a section of the population who make up almost, if not more than half of it, that we've kind of ignored for, and certainly most of my lifetime. And that's in women's sport. And we've seen that now with the way rugby is growing, the way the Women's Six Nations is coming along, the World Cup is coming along, but not least in women's soccer. So when I moved to Sweden, I live in Stockholm in Sweden. When I moved here 24 years ago, I grew up in a generation of Irish men where, female sport was almost invisible. I had one girlfriend at all that time who played camogie, and that was it. And I don't think I ever went to see her play, nor did she want me to go see her play. But that has changed now for the better, right? And I also think that there's an opportunity here for something different, right? The mistakes that we made in terms of allowing a sort of a macho, semi-violent culture to take over in some sports where women didn't feel welcome, we now have a chance to change that with how we perceive women's sport, how we present women's sport, how we produce women's sport. And there's so many untold stories there, and there's so many brilliant things because it is different. The personalities are different, the dynamics are different, and there's so much to be gained from that, especially for brands who are seeking to position themselves and who are seeking to do everything from just general advertising to sponsorship to CSR. There's a huge opportunity there, but you've got to go in there and see this as something of its own making, right? You can't go in there and say, right, well, I sponsored a men's football team for years, therefore I'm going to have exactly the same strategy when it comes to women's football. That's not going to work, right? So what you need to do is you need to take the time to sit down and to listen to people, because this is the future. These people, the people who are playing, the Katie McCabe's of this world, if we take the Irish perspective, Jenny Hermoso, Bonmati, who just won the World Cup with Spain, right? They're inspiring not just a new generation of girls and women, right? They're inspiring boys and men, old men with grey in their beards like me. They're inspiring us as well, right? They are also telling us something about ourselves. What they're telling me as a man of 52 years of age is, you ignored us for so long. Now it's time to give us space. And I'm hearing that, and I'm doing my best to listen to that, right? But we also have to listen to what the audience is saying. What do they want to hear? I always think that the best stories are always the personal, right? So tell me, was it Caicedo, the Colombian soccer player who's only about 18 or 19, and she has already survived ovarian cancer at such a young age and gone on to become one of the most exciting footballers in the world now, playing for Real Madrid, right? Give me all of those stories. Give me tales of redemption. Give me tales of adversity. Give me all of those things, but do it in the female context. Do it in a respectful way. Don't do it by comparing these players to Ronaldo or Messi or Brian O'Driscoll or Jamie Heaslip, right? That's not the context in which this is occurring, because there's great players, great female players who have gone before them, right? So certainly as men involved in sport, we need to listen to that. We need to see what the norms are. We need to learn the language that we don't yet have. But there's a huge potential here to go on and to inspire and to tell these stories. And that for me is almost a payback for so many women I know who didn't get the recognition, who didn't get the prizes, who didn't earn the money, But what we can do to honor their legacy and getting us to where we are today is to take the next generation forward and to give them that platform. But most of all, to give them the respect and to give them the chance to tell their own stories with the help of brands, with the help of sporting organizations and federations, and to let them lead the way, because they're the ones who know the stories better than anybody else.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with that anymore. I think what's fascinating from my perspective is the FIFA Women's World Cup has been brilliant. It's created that opportunity for stories to be told and to create new heroes for, as you rightly said, not just girls, but for boys as well. The days of everyone going out and playing football wanting to be Messi are gone, hopefully. Now they're going out and they want to potentially be Katie McCabe, or they want to be whoever player in their own country. And that's only got to be good. But the next steps are what needs to make sure it's done properly. And I think there's an opportunity for clubs out there. There's an opportunity for brands out there. But there's also an opportunity for the sporting universe out there. I won't say the website, but I found it disturbing that I saw scorelines coming up on this particular website where they said Spain women 0, Ireland women 0, instead of saying Spain 0, Ireland 0. Yeah. Those are the little things that matter. Those are little things that need to change. The mentality needs to change with it. And you need to go there and enjoy a sporting occasion. I also live in Gothenburg. Sweden is one of those countries that has embraced this a little bit quicker. And my father-in-law would bring me to a game at the weekend, and he would say, "Come on, we'll go watch a game on Saturday in Little Edhead, where I'm living close to." And we get in the car and I drive down there, and I wouldn't have a clue until I got there whether it was a men's game or a women's game. And that's where you need to get to. That's the element you need to want to achieve to. And sporting clubs and sporting federations have a responsibility to it. The general public have a responsibility to get behind it and support it. And then everything else from the players and the journalists that Corey, you're involved in, need to also step up into this and see the opportunity that are there. Once that happens, brands will fall behind that, because brands will follow that trend, and we'll see that trend quite nicely. It's an interesting one. If you look at the brands that are connected in that Women's World Cup, you look at the logos that go around the stadium, they're very, 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 very good logos. They're very high popular brands. They just need to go up another level again, and that's possible to do, and I hope that's what we're going to see in the next 4 years. Philip, I'm going to go on to the last little topic that I have, which is a little kind of fun for me, if I'm honest. It's something that I kind of do in my own quick little time. It's a quick fire top 10, right? So it's little ones versus ones, and then there's other bits included that will be questions involved in it. So I'll try and start with this for you. I'll go coffee or tea?
Oh, coffee every day of the week.
Fika or go to the pub?
It depends who's the fika with and who's going to the pub with me. But I would usually say go to the pub. Actually, I don't even drink alcohol, but for the last little while, I would have to say definitely going to the pub. We've had a few good days of the Irish community in the pub here recently.
Favorite social media platform?
Twitter has to be, despite the fact that it's now on fire. But that's the place where I've made my name.
Isn't that fun though? That's part of the fun of Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. So it does
for now. But you know, it's becoming unbearable.
Ticket for All-Ireland or ticket for a World Cup final?
Again, depends who's playing. If Dublin are playing, a ticket for an All-Ireland. If Ireland are playing, a ticket for a World Cup final. But that's a hard one. I'd almost have to toss a coin on that. But Croke Park on All-Ireland final Sunday, we'll have to take the All-Ireland final.
On to the All-Ireland stuff. Club or county?
County for me, has to be.
County or country?
Country, definitely, yeah. Now, that's the thing. The problem is the GAA doesn't have the international, apart from playing against Australia and the compromise rules, you know. So, but yeah, definitely, you know, when it comes to the soccer teams, the rugby teams, country, definitely, I burn a little bit more for that.
Messi or Maradona?
Oh, I'm going to have to say Messi because of the era he did it in. And, yeah, no, and like, you know, because he lived through so many years of Barcelona, whereas Maradona's career was brilliant, but so much shorter.
GAA or hurling? So Gaelic football or hurling?
As a player, Gaelic football, because I'm a better Gaelic footballer than I'm a hurler. But hurling is just the sport of the gods. I mean, to watch it, it's just an incredible sport. So unless it's the Dublin footballers, at which point it's on another level altogether.
Best ever match you've watched?
The best ever match I watched, my word, I would probably say, oh, that's a real tough one. The All-Ireland final 2011, when Dublin won for the first time in such a long time, you know, that has to be it, you know. I think just because of the significance of that, Stephen Cluxton kicking that point as if it was nothing, you know, that'd have to be it. I
can hear Kieran Donaghy in my chats giving out to me on that one. Strangest ever moment you saw in sport?
The strangest ever moment I saw in sport, what would that be? God almighty. God, that really is putting me on the spot now, because there's been an awful lot of them. Strangest ever moment I saw in sport. Oh, I'll give it to a Brazilian aerial skier at the Sochi Olympics in 2014, right? So aerial skiing is where you take a little ski jump and you do a couple of sort of twists and turns and that kind of thing. This Brazilian woman had practiced all her life, and she came down, she did 3 backflips, came last in the competition, and I've never met anybody happier to do so. She was an Olympian. She was happy with that, as well she should be.
That is sport right there. Here's a last question for you. If someone announced tomorrow morning that sport was banned, right? That you're no more watching sport, no more involved in sport, how would that impact you?
I wouldn't have a job. I wouldn't have anything to talk about. I wouldn't have a hobby. I'd barely have a friend. That's how much it means, Ant, because it's the first thing that you and I talked about when we first met was sport. Your background in Munster, my background in journalism, and we've been talking about for the last year or so since we first got to know each other. It literally is, it's that important to me. It's everywhere. Like behind this camera here are bookshelves full of sport. The next conversation I have today is going to be about sport. The next story I write is going to be about sport. The next podcast I make is likely to be about sport. It's literally everything to me. It's everything I have.
I love that answer. Just coming to the end. First of all, thanks very much for your time. Well, I'll ask you if you want to give a shout out to what you're doing next. You mentioned you're going to be writing something, or what's the next podcast, or where people can get up with yourself and your stories.
Yeah, so I suppose the best thing to do is to follow at Philip O'Connor on Twitter. I'm going to be there for now. I think I have the same name on Blue Sky, and at Philip Ablana on Instagram. And what I'm really trying to do at the moment is I'm trying to build 2 podcasts. One is the Irish in Sweden podcast for the community that you and I live in, and the other is the Global Gael podcast, which is for the global Irish community. So I'm really trying to build those because I really believe in podcasting as a medium. I've always loved radio, as I mentioned there, working in local radio back in the day. And I just think that that's the place where we have a great platform. There's a great sense of interaction there. People interact with podcasts, they listen to them, they can be the passive listener in a conversation between the likes of ourselves. And I think that there's a great sense of warmth and togetherness to be had from those things. And aside from that, I do a lot of work around sport for the Reuters News Agency and that kind of thing. But if you follow me on Twitter, you'll be fairly well able to keep up with what I'm doing until they boot me off it, if he ever does that, Mr. Musk.
Yeah, I don't think he's listening somehow, but you never know.
Yeah, if he's any sense, he is.
He should be, but sure, that's a different conversation for a different day. Philip O'Connor, as always, my man, it's been fantastic talking to you. I massively appreciate your time. And look, until we talk again, slán.
We will indeed. Thanks very much for having me on.
That was Philip O'Connor. I gotta say, 36 minutes, and I know full well I could have been on for another 15 or 20. Absolutely fascinating, man. Fascinating conversation. Some real good tidbits included within that, as I'm sure you can imagine. Brilliant to talk to him. He'll be one of my proper guests, and it's great to listen to. I've got quite a few of these coming to drop on our website, amsc.se. You can contact me by email if you want. Anthony.Morrissey@amsc.se to see if we can help you with some of the projects that we spoke about with Philip and some of the conversations we had with Philip. Maybe that rang a bell for yourself. Make sure you follow us, subscribe to the channel, follow us on all the social media platforms you could possibly do. Before I go, it's a mantra I'm going to live by, and I'm going to leave with you all the time. Regular conversation that I want my customers to look at, and that's chase the sun. What do I mean by chase the sun? Well, every day you wake up, you should look outside and you should look for the sun. If it's there, brilliant. Keep chasing and finding it. If it's stuck behind clouds or rain, just remember that it's up there, and it's up to you to go and find it, no matter what you do and no matter how you do it. Again, thanks for listening. Keep talking to me. Look after yourself. Have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.